Hello there, and welcome. Tonight we are stepping far away from everything familiar. No cities, no machines, no warm glow of electric light. Only the quiet wilderness of the Stone Age, where survival was never guaranteed and every day was earned with effort, fear, and a little bit of hope. I'd like you to imagine it for a moment. A small group of early humans huddles close together. The sun has just vanished, and the world is darker than we can easily picture. There are no walls, no doors to close, only the faint outline of trees and the sound of unseen creatures moving in the distance. They do not know how long this night will feel, but they know one thing. They must face it, as they always have, with nothing but their wits and each other. This is not history told from a distance. This is the human story as it truly began. Before tools were perfected, before fire was mastered, before the first sparks of civilization lit the world, there was a kind of persistence that carried our ancestors through every hungry season, every cold night, and every danger that lurked in the shadows. So if you are ready, let the noise of the present fade a little. Set aside the steady ticking of clocks and the constant hum of modern life. We are going to walk slowly, carefully into an age where time was not measured in hours but in sunrises and sunsets. A time when survival was not an idea, it was the only thing that mattered. Before there was fire, the world was a very different place for our ancestors. The sun was their only dependable source of light and warmth, and when it disappeared beyond the horizon, the earth changed. Darkness was not just an absence of sight, it was a presence, a living weight that pressed against the edges of human awareness. When night came, so did the cold, so did the sounds of the wild, and in that long stretch between dusk and dawn, survival was nothing short of a nightly negotiation with nature itself. Imagine standing in that world. There are no lamps to push back the shadows, no gentle hum of electricity, no safe glow from a distant town on the horizon. When the sun goes down, it is gone, and the sky above is an unbroken ocean of black. Stars glitter, sharp and cold, but they offer no warmth. The moon might cast its pale reflection over the land, but it is fickle, sometimes gone entirely, leaving nothing but darkness. And in that darkness, every rustle, every snap of a twig is a reminder that humans were far from the only creatures awake. Before fire, our ancestors relied on their senses and on one another. Small groups stayed close. They learned quickly that a lone human at night was little more than an opportunity for predators. Lions, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, these were not distant fears but immediate threats. To survive, humans gathered together in numbers. They slept in clusters, not because it was comfortable, but because it was safer. A dozen pairs of eyes and ears were better than one, and in the absence of fire, vigilance was their only defence. In those early days, fear was not an enemy. It was a tool. Fear kept them alert. Fear taught them to find shelter before the sun slipped away. They used caves when they could find them, not only because they provided cover from the weather, but because stone walls were easier to defend than open ground. When caves were not available, they sought natural hollows in the earth or dense thickets where their bodies could be concealed. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Cold was another relentless adversary. We forget, living in homes with blankets and heaters, just how merciless a night could be without warmth. Early humans wore what they could, animal skins draped over their shoulders, crude wrappings made from whatever they could find. They pressed their bodies together for shared heat, a habit not born of comfort, but necessity. To be alone in the cold was to risk death. Survival was a matter of staying close enough to feel another heartbeat, and hoping that the collective warmth of the group could hold the night at bay. But even as they shivered in the darkness, they learned. The Stone Age was not just a time of danger. It was a time of relentless adaptation. Humans became masters of watching the world and noticing its patterns. They learned which caves faced away from the wind. They learned how to read the behaviour of animals, to sense when danger was near, and to move silently when the night demanded it. In a world without light, their ears grew sharp. The faintest crack of a branch could send the entire group into stillness. And then there were the skies. Long before humans understood astronomy, they knew the stars, not their names or their distances, but their constancy. The stars were the only lights that never went out. They told our ancestors when seasons were shifting, when it was time to move, when prey might migrate. In the absence of fire, the heavens were their silent map, their clock, their reminder that even in the dark there was order. Food, of course, was another nightly concern. Without fire, there was no cooking. They ate what could be eaten raw, plants, fruits, roots, and whatever meat could be torn from bone without preparation. This was not a diet of comfort, but of survival. They learned to chew tough fibres, to break marrow bones with stones for the rich fat inside, and to stomach things that would make us hesitate today. Every bite mattered. Hunger was not an occasional discomfort. It was an ever-present companion. But necessity has always been the parent of invention. The darkness forced early humans to create routines. They foraged and hunted while the sun was up, racing daylight to gather as much as they could before the world turned black. They became efficient, moving with a purpose born not from discipline but from sheer instinct. When the sun began to sink, the urgency sharpened. There was no margin for delay. Those who lingered too long in the open learned the cost of hesitation. Predators ruled the night, but humans were clever. They developed strategies long before fire came to their rescue. They learned to climb trees when danger prowled too close. They discovered the value of staying silent and still, of vanishing into the landscape instead of confronting it. They understood that survival often meant not being seen at all. Yet even in this perilous world, there were moments of stillness. When the group was hidden away, and the sounds of the wild dulled into the distance, they would rest. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and cautious. One or two stayed awake while the others closed their eyes, a rotating watch that passed through the night until the first light of dawn returned. In those hours, our ancestors built the foundations of cooperation. They depended on one another because there was no other choice. That reliance on the group, born in darkness, would become one of humanity's greatest strengths. Still, there must have been nights of terror, nights when the scrape of claws outside a cave or the low growl of something unseen made every breath freeze in their throats. They could do nothing but wait, clutching stones or sticks, hoping the danger would pass, and sometimes it didn't. Survival was not guaranteed, and for every group that endured, there were others who did not. But those who lived learned. Every narrow escape carved lessons into memory, and those lessons were passed down, not in words at first, but in behaviour. Children watched, they imitated, and over time those instincts became tradition. This was life before fire, a cycle of fear, hunger, and relentless adaptation. And yet, within that struggle, something remarkable was happening. The human mind was sharpening. Every challenge demanded solutions. Every night in the cold demanded a new way of thinking. That pressure, constant and unyielding, was slowly shaping the species that would one day learn not just to endure the darkness, but to banish it. When the first sparks of fire came, they did not appear in a world that was ready for comfort. They appeared in a world where every scrap of warmth, every faint glow, was nothing short of a miracle. Fire would not just change the night, it would change what it meant to be human. And so, before firelight ever pushed back the darkness, our ancestors learned to live with it. They became watchers of the night, silent students of the wilderness, creatures who understood that to survive they had to adapt. They didn't conquer the world in those early days, they learned to endure it, and in doing so they prepared themselves for the moment that would transform everything. Because once the first flames crackled and the night was no longer absolute, everything that came before would seem like a different world entirely. The first time humans saw fire, it was not their own. It came from the sky in the form of lightning or from the earth when forests burned. It was wild, uncontrollable and dangerous. At first, it was something to be feared. The sight of flames ripping through trees or crawling across the grasslands must have filled our ancestors with both terror and awe. They had no words for it, no concept of what it truly was, but they understood one thing immediately. Nothing else in their world behaved like fire. In the beginning, fire was a thing to be watched from a distance, but survival often depends on curiosity, and over time that fear turned into something else. Humans learned that when the world burned, there was opportunity. After the flames moved on, they found roasted animals left behind, easier to chew and safer to eat than raw meat. They found that fire kept away predators who normally stalk the edges of their camps, and they discovered warmth that could cut through the bitter cold of night. It is difficult for us to imagine just how profound this change was. For hundreds of thousands of years, night was the enemy. Darkness ruled, cold bit into skin and bone, and predators prowled unchecked. Then, one day, humans learned to carry fire with them, to keep it alive rather than merely watching it burn and vanish. They likely began by taking embers from natural fires, protecting them, feeding them with dry grass and wood. It was a fragile thing at first, something that could die as easily as it was born, but it was enough. For the first time, the darkness had a boundary. Picture a small group gathered around one of those early fires. The flames dance and crackle, painting the walls of a cave or the trunks of nearby trees in shifting light. For the first time, the black void beyond their shelter is pushed back. The cold is softened. The sounds of the night, the howls, the rustling, the snapping of branches, seem farther away. The fire doesn't just warm their skin, it changes how they feel inside. Fear loosens its grip. Around the fire, there is safety. With fire came more than warmth and light. It became the first real tool for shaping the world. Meat could be cooked, making it easier to eat and far more nourishing. Roots and plants that were once too tough or bitter became edible. The human diet expanded, and with it, our brains were fed the fuel they needed to grow. Fire quite literally gave us the energy to become more than what we were. Predators, once the rulers of the night, learned to fear the glow. A ring of fire was a barrier even the boldest hunters rarely crossed. For the first time, humans were no longer entirely at the mercy of the wild. They could defend a space, create a circle of light where only they belonged. In that circle, they were not just surviving, they were beginning to claim a small piece of the world as their own. But fire did more than protect and feed. It brought people together. In the deep past, when night fell and there was no fire, humans scattered into whatever shelter they could find, huddling separately against the cold. Fire changed that. It created a centre. People gathered around it not only for warmth but for company. They talked, or if words had not yet fully formed, they grunted and gestured. They shared food, they shared silence, they shared safety. Around the fire, they became more than individuals. They became a group bound not just by need but by connection. This was the beginning of something more than survival. Firelight stretched the day. Before it, humans lived and worked only as long as the sun allowed. When darkness came, the world ended until morning. But with fire there was now a new kind of time. Hours carved out of the night where stories could be told, tools could be sharpened, and plans could be made. Under that flickering glow, human culture began to take root. Over generations, our ancestors learned not just to guard fire, but to make it. The discovery of how to spark flames from stone or friction must have been nothing short of miraculous. To strike two rocks and see a spark, to rub wood until it smoked and burst into flame, this was control over something that had once been a force of nature. It was power, not the kind measured in strength or speed, but the kind that changed the balance between humanity and the world. Yet fire demanded respect. It was not a tame thing. A flame left unchecked could consume shelters and drive entire groups from their homes. To keep fire was to understand it, to feed it carefully, to watch it constantly. In many ways, those early humans were as much servants to the flame as they were its masters, but it was a service gladly given because nothing else offered so much in return. The more humans used fire, the more it reshaped them. Cooked food strengthened bodies. Warmth allowed survival in colder climates, letting small bands of people push farther into lands that would once have been deadly. Darkness became less terrifying, and sleep became less dangerous when predators stayed away from the glow. Step by step, fire was turning a fragile species into one that could endure almost anywhere. And in the quiet hours by the firelight, something else began to grow. With fear held at bay and hunger eased, the mind had room to wander. Maybe it was here, in the shifting shadows cast against cave walls, that the first sparks of imagination stirred. Watching flames dance is hypnotic even now. For those early humans, it must have been otherworldly. Perhaps it was in these long, firelit nights that the seeds of storytelling were planted, when someone pointed at the shapes in the shadows and gave them meaning. Even today, there is something about sitting near a fire that feels older than language. The crackle of wood, the slow, steady heat, the way people gather in a circle and speak in hushed voices. It is an echo of the first great invention that made the night ours. But fire was not only a gift, it was also a challenge, one that demanded knowledge and discipline. Humans had to learn how to find dry wood, how to keep a flame alive in wind and rain, how to shield it from being snuffed out. They had to carry it with them when they moved, cradling glowing embers in bundles of bark or clay. A single mistake could mean a night without warmth, without safety, without food. Fire was a treasure that could be lost, and every group knew what it meant to lose it. Yet those who mastered it thrived. They began to explore further. They ventured into colder lands, knowing they could bring their own warmth with them. They learned to cook not just meat, but plants, unlocking food sources that had been useless before. They used fire to harden wooden spears, making them deadlier in the hunt. Bit by bit, fire transformed humanity from prey into something far more formidable. And perhaps the greatest gift fire gave was time itself. With fire, humans could drive back the darkness, stretch their waking hours and gather in ways they never had before. They no longer vanished into sleep the moment the sun was gone. They stayed awake. They worked. They thought. They became more than creatures reacting to the world. They became planners, creators, dreamers. The world before fire was a place of fear, of cold, of endless caution. The world after fire was still dangerous, but now there was a line drawn in the dark, a circle of warmth and light where humans could sit and feel, for the first time, a little less small. And in that circle, the next great steps of survival were waiting, because with fire came not only safety, but the chance to build, to learn, and to imagine what else might be possible. Fire gave humans light and warmth, but it was stone that gave them the means to shape the world with their own hands. Long before villages, long before farming, and long before the first trace of written words, there were stones chipped and sharpened until they could cut, crush, and pierce. In those days, survival was not only about avoiding danger or keeping warm, it was about finding ways to act on the world instead of merely reacting to it, and the first tools were the proof that humans could do exactly that. The earliest tools were simple: a broken rock with a sharp edge, a rounded stone heavy enough to smash bone. These were not inventions in the way we think of them today, with plans and blueprints. They were discoverers. Someone, perhaps by accident, struck two stones together and saw one split into a jagged edge. That edge could slice meat or scrape hide. A moment of chance became a lesson, and a lesson became something worth repeating. Imagine one of those first tools in a human hand. It is heavy, uneven, and crude, but for the person holding it, it is nothing short of power. With that edge, they can carve flesh from a carcass more easily, split open bones for the rich marrow inside, or cut away tough plant fibres that would have been impossible to manage before. The difference between bare hands and a sharp stone was the difference between constant struggle and the beginnings of control. Over time, those stones changed. Early humans began to see that not every rock was the same. Some broke cleanly, some dulled too quickly, and some shattered into useless fragments. Through trial and error, they learned which stones worked best. Flint, obsidian, and chert became prized not for how they looked, but for how they behaved when struck. A well-chipped flake could hold an edge sharp enough to cut through hide or wood, and that sharpness meant less time, less effort, and more food. These tools were not only for the hunt. They were used to scrape animal skins clean, to cut them into shapes that could be tied or wrapped for clothing. They were used to break open nuts and grind roots into something more edible. They chipped wood into usable forms, stripped bark for rope, and carved marks that may have been the first hints of human thought etched into the world. Each of these small actions, multiplied over countless generations, pushed humans further away from simply surviving and closer to shaping their own destiny. Toolmaking was not instinctual. It had to be learned. Children watched their parents and imitated their movements, striking stones against each other until the right sound and the right shape appeared. Every flake of rock carried a lesson. The wrong angle meant a useless fragment. The right one meant a cutting edge that could change a day's hunt. Skills like these could not be written down or stored anywhere but in memory. They passed from hand to hand, generation after generation, in a chain of knowledge as old as humanity itself. These tools changed the way humans hunted. Before sharp stones, scavenging was a way of life. Early humans often waited until larger predators had their fill before creeping in to claim what was left. A cracked femur for marrow, a strip of meat left behind. These scraps were survival. But with stone tools, humans could process carcasses more efficiently. They could cut faster, carry more, and leave less for the scavengers that followed them. And slowly they began to shift from scavengers to hunters. The first spears were not yet elegant weapons. They were simply sharpened sticks, sometimes hardened in fire, but their effectiveness grew exponentially when tipped with sharp stone points. A wooden spear could wound. A stone-tipped spear could kill. With that change, hunting became less desperate. Small animals gave way to larger prey, and groups that once depended on chance now stalked their quarry with deliberate intent. But stone tools were not only for the hunt. They transformed every part of life. They allowed the building of sturdier shelters, the processing of tougher materials, and the defense of territory against predators. A sharpened stone lashed to a stick could make the difference between driving off a predator and becoming its meal. In that sense, tools were not only instruments. They were extensions of the human body, new teeth and claws forged from rock and willpower. The making of tools also demanded something new: foresight. To craft a cutting edge or shape a spear point, one had to imagine the result before it existed. This was more than survival instinct. This was planning. The ability to hold an idea in the mind and then bring it into the world was one of humanity's quiet revolutions. That single leap, from reacting to imagining, was as significant as fire itself. With tools came cooperation. A single person could shape a stone, but entire groups benefited from those who were skilled at it. A good toolmaker became as valuable as a strong hunter. One might sit at the edge of the camp chipping away at flint while others brought food or prepared hides. In this way, roles began to form, and with roles came the first faint outlines of something larger than survival: society. Even in their simplicity, these stones held within them the blueprint of everything to come. The chipping of flint was the ancestor of engineering. The first tied stone point was the ancestor of technology. Each tool was a quiet declaration that humans would not simply take the world as it was. They would change it piece by piece, and as the tools improved, so did the world humans inhabited. With sharper blades, hides could be cut more cleanly, stitched together with sinew, and turned into clothing that kept out the cold. With heavier stone hammers, bones could be smashed into fragments that yielded every last drop of marrow. With finely chipped scrapers, wood could be shaped into handles and shelters. Survival became not just a matter of enduring, but of shaping, adjusting, and mastering. Yet even with these tools, life was never easy. A broken stone edge at the wrong moment could mean the loss of a meal. A failed strike in the hunt could mean days of hunger. Every tool, no matter how sharp or well made, was only as good as the hands that used it. And so, humans practiced. They chipped stones not only when they needed them, but because they understood, at least in some unspoken way, that preparation could mean the difference between life and death. In those long nights by the fire, while predators prowled just beyond the glow, stones were shaped into new forms. The sound of flint striking flint echoed softly in the dark, a rhythm as old as humanity itself. And with every spark, every chip, every sharpened edge, humans carved a little more of their future into the world. The leap from empty hands to hands holding stone was not a single moment. It was a slow, grinding climb built on countless small victories, but each stone carried with it the same message. Humans were learning not only to survive the world, but to change it, one strike at a time, and with tools in their hands they were ready for the next challenge that would define them, the language that would bind them together and turn survival into something shared. A sharp stone in the hand gave humans power, but it was language that allowed them to use that power together. Before words, survival was limited to what each person could see and do for themselves. But the world was too dangerous, and life was too demanding for anyone to face it alone. The ability to share ideas, warn of danger, plan a hunt, or comfort one another was not just an advantage. It was the difference between life and death. At first, it wasn't language as we know it. It was sound. Cries, grunts, and gestures carried meaning long before anyone spoke in structured sentences. A raised hand might have signaled danger. A sharp call could send the group scattering into hiding. Over time, these sounds grew more specific. A single gesture or noise might point not only to predator, but to which predator or where it was. Each small refinement made survival more certain. Picture a group moving silently through the grasslands in search of game. One hunter notices movement in the distance, the faint shadow of an animal against the horizon. Without words, only simple sounds and signs, he alerts the others. They shift their positions, spread out, and prepare. No one has to guess. No one is left behind. What began as instinct has become something more, a shared system that binds the group together. Language did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, piece by piece, carried forward by necessity. A single sound used often enough gained weight. A gesture repeated enough times became universal within the group. As children watched and imitated, those signals passed to the next generation, until they no longer had to be invented. They simply existed, part of the fabric of life. These early forms of communication were more than practical. They created trust. When someone pointed toward food or warned of a predator, and the group reacted and survived, the bond between them deepened. Each exchange reinforced a simple but powerful truth. Together, they were safer than they could ever be alone. This ability to share information changed the hunt completely. Alone, a human could only stalk small prey. Together, they could coordinate. One group could drive animals toward another. They could set traps, block escape routes, and surround their quarry in silence until the moment came to strike. Language, even in its rough, early form, turned a scattered collection of individuals into something closer to a single unified force. It also transformed the way humans cared for one another. A wounded hunter could signal pain or point to where he had been injured. Those who stayed behind to tend the fire could call others back when food was ready. Infants and children, unable to fend for themselves, could be soothed and protected with sounds that reassured them. Language, in its simplest form, carried more than commands. It carried comfort. But language was not just for survival in the immediate sense, it was memory. Before language, knowledge existed only in action. You could learn by watching someone chip stone or prepare a hide, but there was no easy way to explain what to do differently. With the beginnings of language, humans could pass on experience. A single sound might indicate which plant was safe to eat, or which river crossing was dangerous. Each word, each gesture, each shared signal was a thread binding the past to the present, allowing the lessons of one generation to live on in the next. And from this came stories. Not stories in the sense we know now, with heroes and endings, but simple narratives passed around the fire. A retelling of how a hunt succeeded, or how danger was narrowly escaped. These were not just recollections, they were instructions disguised as memory. They gave meaning to events, taught lessons without lectures, and allowed knowledge to travel farther than any single person could. With every exchange, the human mind grew sharper. Language demanded more than sound. It required memory, association, and imagination. To say there or later meant understanding not only the present moment, but time and space as concepts. In this way, the effort to survive was quietly shaping the human brain into something capable of far more than reacting to its environment. Even as language grew, it was never perfect. Misunderstanding surely happened. A signal given in panic might be misread. A sound might carry one meaning in one group and another entirely in the next. But for all its flaws, it worked well enough to hold humans together, and once they were bound by communication, their survival changed from individual struggle to something shared. As fires burned through the night, language would have grown richer. In the glow of the flames, away from the constant pressure of the hunt, there was time for more than urgent signals. Sounds became labels for things. Objects and places acquired names. Over countless nights, humans learned to turn their scattered cries into a rough but growing vocabulary, and with it, they began to carve a deeper sense of connection to the world around them. Language also carried something unexpected, the ability to imagine together. Once two people could share an idea, they could plan not only for the moment but for the future. They could picture the hunt before it happened, talk through how they might trap an animal, or decide where to move when the season shifted. This was a step beyond instinct. It was collaboration shaped by thought, and as language spread, so too did culture. Rituals and habits became easier to pass along. The way to prepare a tool, to wrap a wound, or to track an animal could now be taught, refined, and improved. What once depended on imitation could now be explained, adjusted, and shared. Language was not only a survival tool, it was a kind of memory outside the mind, carried in the voices of a community. Even today, traces of that ancient shift remain. When people speak, they are not just exchanging information, they are repeating an old, unbroken habit that began around fires in the dark, when a single sound could mean the difference between life and death. Those first words, crude though they must have been, gave humans something no other species had. The ability to survive not as isolated individuals, but as a collective intelligence. From this, everything else would grow. But in those early days, it was simple. A cry to warn of danger, a gesture to signal food, a sound to call others close when the night grew too quiet. Language began not as a tool for thought, but as a lifeline, and in that role, it became one of the most powerful forces in human history. With words, even in their earliest form, humans were no longer just reacting to the world. They were shaping it together, and soon, with their voices and tools united, they would begin to tame the land that once seemed far too vast to ever belong to them. With tools in their hands and the beginnings of language in their voices, humans were ready to face the most constant challenge of their lives: finding food. Hunger was never far away. It shaped every decision, every movement, and every risk they took. Without reliable food, there could be no rest, no safety, and no future. The hunt and the harvest were not separate tasks. They were two sides of the same struggle, and both demanded everything early humans could give. Hunting began long before humans became skilled at it. At first, they were scavengers. They trailed after larger predators, waiting for a kill to be abandoned. With sharp stones, they stripped meat from bones faster than other scavengers could. They cracked those bones open to reach the marrow inside, a rich source of fat and nutrients that no other creature could reach so easily. This habit was dangerous, but it was also clever. By learning to take what others left behind, humans survived in a world that rarely offered second chances. But scavenging could only feed so many mouths. As groups grew larger and their tools sharper, the focus shifted. Small animals, hares, birds, and reptiles were the first targets. These hunts were often fast and frantic, relying on quick strikes and persistence. A single rabbit might mean the difference between going hungry and surviving another day. Over time, the hunts grew bolder. Humans began to track larger animals, creatures that could feed an entire group if brought down, but could also maim or kill those who dared face them. This is where cooperation became vital. One hunter alone could not take down a deer or an antelope, but many working together could drive it into a trap or corner it in a narrow pass. They learned to watch the wind so their scent would not give them away. They spread out silently across the grasslands, driving their prey toward waiting spears. When the kill came, it was quick and brutal, but it was followed by relief. Every successful hunt brought more than food. It brought the assurance that their efforts and their trust in one another had been worth it. Hunting was not only about strength or courage, it required patience, knowledge, and an understanding of the land. Hunters learned to read tracks pressed into the mud, to follow broken branches, to notice the faintest scatter of droppings that might mark an animal's path. They understood the seasons, knowing when herds would migrate and when prey would be weakest. Every hunt was a test of observation, as much as it was a test of endurance. Even with these skills, failure was common. A missed throw, a sudden shift in the wind, or the sharp eyes of a wary animal could turn a long hunt into a wasted day. There were times when the group returned empty-handed, and those were the nights when the harvest, the gathering of plants, fruits and roots, kept them alive. Foraging was no less important than hunting. Early humans became keen students of the land around them. They learned which berries were safe and which ones could kill. They dug for roots hidden beneath the soil and peeled away their bitter skins to reach what was edible inside. They cracked nuts with stones, collecting every scrap of nourishment they could find. It was slower, quieter work than the hunt, but it was no less critical. A handful of wild fruit or a basket of tubers could stretch a meagre supply of meat long enough for the hunters to try again. The knowledge required for this was immense. Plants changed with the seasons. Some were safe only when ripe, others had to be soaked or pounded before they could be eaten. This knowledge could not be guessed. It had to be remembered and taught. A single mistake could poison not just one person, but an entire group. And so, generation after generation, humans passed down a silent library of information: where to find food, how to prepare it, and what signs to trust when the forest or grassland seemed unfamiliar. Food gathering was not just about sustenance, it shaped how humans moved. Entire groups followed the rhythm of their meals, travelling with migrating herds or returning each year to the same patches of fruit and nuts. They learned the roots of animals not only to hunt them, but to share in what they left behind: a carcass abandoned by lions, a trail of seeds dropped by birds, even the leftovers from other scavengers. Nothing was wasted. In time, hunting and foraging began to merge into a single balanced strategy. Meat offered dense vital calories, but plants provided consistency. Together they allowed humans to endure. When one source failed, the other filled the gap. This flexibility gave humans an edge that few other creatures possessed. They could eat nearly anything. They could survive nearly anywhere. Still, both hunting and foraging carried risk. Hunting demanded courage and strength, but foraging required vigilance. A hunter might face a charging animal, but a gatherer could just as easily face danger from a venomous snake coiled in the grass or a hidden predator waiting in the shadows. Every step in the search for food came with the awareness that one mistake could be fatal. Yet despite these dangers, the hunt and the harvest became more than survival tasks. They became rituals. A successful hunt meant celebration, a chance to eat well, to rest, and to feel, if only for a moment, like the world had been pushed back. Foraging trips were quieter but no less important, often done in small groups where knowledge was exchanged and bonds were strengthened. These shared efforts were not just about eating, they were about belonging, and while food kept the body alive, it also gave humans the time and strength to think, to plan, and to innovate. A well-fed group could make better tools, explore new lands, and teach their children the skills they needed to thrive. Hunger pressed them forward, but every meal pulled them a little farther from desperation, and a little closer to mastery over their world. Step by step, bite by bite, the hunt and the harvest carried humanity through the Stone Age. They learned not only how to survive, but how to thrive in places where other creatures could not. They became predators, gatherers, and above all, problem solvers. And as their bellies filled and their minds sharpened, they began to build the foundations of everything that would follow. But food was only one part of the battle. Even a full stomach could not keep out the wind or the rain. For that, humans needed something else entirely. Shelter that could hold back the wilderness, if only for a little while. Food gave humans the strength to endure, but strength alone was never enough. The world was too cold, too wet, and too unforgiving for bare skin and open ground. Rain turned the earth to mud. Winds howled across the plains, stripping away warmth in minutes. Winter nights froze the air so sharply that every breath burned in the lungs. Without protection, even the strongest hunter or the most skilled gatherer would not last long. That is why shelter became as essential as fire or food, a barrier between human fragility and the relentless force of nature. At first, shelter was not built. It was found. Caves and rock overhangs offered natural protection from storms, and for countless generations these were humanity's safest havens. Inside a cave, the wind was muted, the rain silenced, and the darkness was predictable. Predators could still find their way in, but a single entrance was easier to guard than the open wild. Families and small groups huddled together in these stone refuges, using the earth itself as a shield. But caves were not everywhere. Many regions had none at all, and those that existed were often already claimed, by other humans or by the very predators they were trying to escape. When caves could not be found, humans adapted. They learned to build. Their first shelters were little more than crude windbreaks, branches stacked against each other, hides stretched across poles, or pits dug into the ground and covered with vegetation. Simple as they were, these makeshift walls could turn a freezing night into one that could be endured. Over time, these shelters grew more sophisticated. Groups began to use animal bones, especially from mammoths and other large prey, as frames for their structures. They draped these frames in hides, weighing them down with stones to keep out the wind. Some even dug shallow depressions before building, sinking their homes slightly into the ground to trap heat. Each innovation came not from comfort, but from sheer necessity. The difference between a poorly built shelter and a well-made one could mean the difference between life and death. Inside those shelters, life took on a different rhythm. Outside was danger, predators prowling, storms raging, the constant uncertainty of the wild. Inside there was warmth from the fire, the smell of drying hides, and the steady breathing of those who slept shoulder to shoulder. The walls may have been crude, but they offered something that humans had never truly known before, a space that was theirs. Shelter was more than physical safety. It changed how humans lived. Once a group could build and maintain a protected space, They no longer had to wander endlessly in search of caves or other natural refuges. They could stay in one place longer. They could stockpile food, strengthen their tools, and care for their young without moving camp every few days. Even if they were still nomadic, these early shelters gave them a stability that nature alone could never provide. Shelters also became the first true centres of human life. Within them, tools were sharpened, hides were scraped, and plans were made for the next hunt. Children learned by watching their elders prepare food and craft weapons by the dim firelight. Stories, whether spoken or gestured, were shared in the warmth of those spaces. What happened outside the shelter determined survival. What happened inside determined what it meant to live together. Building and maintaining these homes required cooperation. No single person could carry the massive bones of a mammoth or stretch a hide large enough to cover an entire frame. Groups had to work in unison, lifting, tying and securing each piece while others gathered fuel for the fire or watched for danger. Shelter was not only protection from the storm, it was proof that humans were learning to depend on one another in ways no other creature could match. The seasons forced them to adapt further. In summer, shelters were lighter, simple structures to keep out rain and provide shade from the sun. In winter, they became sturdier, built lower to the ground to trap heat and shield against the wind. Some groups even insulated their shelters with layers of grass or moss, packing it into gaps to block the cold. These small adjustments added up, allowing humans to survive in places far harsher than their bodies alone would have allowed. But shelter was never perfect. A wall of hides could not stop the sound of wolves howling outside, or keep the shadow of a prowling predator from passing by. It could not hold off every storm or keep the cold entirely at bay. What it did, however, was buy time. It gave humans the space to rest, to recover, and to think. It turned survival from a constant sprint into something closer to a steady, grueling march forward. And with every storm that passed while they remained dry and alive inside, shelter became something else as well, a source of confidence. For the first time, humans could look at the forces of nature and feel that they had a chance. That sense of control, however small, fueled the next steps of their evolution. Shelter also allowed something that was just as important as warmth or safety: the ability to dream of what came next. A secure camp meant that for a few precious hours humans could sit by the fire and plan beyond the immediate moment. They could imagine the next hunt, prepare better tools, or repair what had been broken. In that space carved out of the wilderness, human life gained the rhythm it had always lacked. A place where each day could build upon the last instead of being a fight that started from nothing every morning. Still, for every shelter they built, nature reminded them that they were only borrowing space. Winds tore down frames, floods washed away camps, predators learned to wait near the edges of human dwellings, knowing that hunger would eventually drive someone out. Survival was never permanent, only extended. And yet, each new shelter stood as a promise. Humans were no longer content to be chased across the land by storms or driven out by cold. They were learning to hold their ground. Those crude homes of bone and hide were the first small defiance against the endless power of nature. They did not conquer the storm, but they refused to yield entirely to it. In those walls, thin, fragile and imperfect, humanity discovered something that would define them forever: the determination to make a world that was theirs, even if it began with nothing more than sticks, stones, and the will to survive another night. And as they sat within those walls, listening to the wind scream and the rain strike the earth, they knew that outside their fragile refuge, other dangers waited in the dark. Because while storms and cold could be endured, there was something else that never stopped watching: the predators of the night. Even inside their shelters, early humans could not escape the feeling of being watched. The night was alive with eyes they could not see. Every crack of a branch or low growl beyond the firelight was a reminder that they were never truly alone. Predators ruled the darkness, and if humans wanted to live, they had to learn how to face it, In those days, fear was not weakness. It was survival. It sharpened every sense, forcing humans to listen to the quiet sounds most creatures ignored. They became attuned to the subtle rustle of grass that might mean a stalking cat or the distant bark of hyenas circling in the dark. The world after sunset was a dangerous theatre, and every sound, every shadow was a cue that could not be missed. For this reason, humans developed a habit that would define them. They kept watch. While some slept, others stayed awake, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the reach of the fire. These watchers listened for the heavy footfalls of a bear, the sharp crack of a branch broken by something large, or the soft, almost silent approach of a predator's paws. Sleep came in shifts, shallow and brief, but it was enough to keep the group alive. The fire helped, but it was not a perfect defense. Many predators feared the flames, but hunger could make even the boldest creatures reckless. A starving pack of wolves or a desperate cat might still test the edge of the firelight. Humans learned quickly that vigilance could not falter. One lapse, one moment of stillness, and the night could swallow them whole. These night watches were not only about spotting danger, they were also about learning it. Humans became expert observers of predators. They learned the calls of different animals, which sounds meant a distant threat and which ones meant immediate danger. They studied the way lions hunted in silence, the way hyenas laughed in the dark, the way leopards dragged kills into trees. This knowledge turned fear into strategy. To survive the night, they had to understand what shared it with them. And in a strange way, the night gave them something else: discipline. They learned to take turns, to trust that while they slept, someone else would keep watch. This trust built unity. The watchers were not only guards, they were the thread holding the group together. Without them, fear would have driven every individual into restless isolation. But because someone was always awake, the others could close their eyes, even if only for a little while. Children grew up in this world of constant awareness. They listened to the warnings whispered by their parents, to the low sounds that sent the group into silence, and to the sharp, clipped calls that meant danger was near. These lessons became instinct, passed from one generation to the next until even the youngest could read the night like a map. Predators shaped more than behaviour, they shaped tools. Spears and sharpened stones were not only for hunting, they were defences. Humans learned to keep weapons close at hand while they slept. A sudden cry from a watcher could bring the group to their feet, ready to strike at whatever dared to cross the boundary of the fire. Each successful defence made the group bolder, but never careless. In the Stone Age, caution was not a choice. It was the price of survival. Even as humans guarded against the night, they also adapted to it. They learned to move quietly when they had to leave the safety of camp. They studied the wind to carry their scent away from prowling hunters. Their eyes adjusted to the faint glow of starlight, and their ears grew sensitive enough to catch the faintest hint of movement. For every predator that stalked them, they became better at stalking the night itself. The predators, in turn, forced humans closer to one another. Alone, a person stood no chance against a lion or a pack of wolves. Together, they became something even the fiercest hunters hesitated to face. When danger pressed too close, the group did not scatter. They closed ranks, spears pointed outward, fire between them and the darkness. This unity, born in fear, became one of humanity's greatest strengths. Over time, those nights of watchfulness created more than safety. They created awareness. Humans began to understand not only the behaviour of predators, but the larger rhythms of the world. They noticed which nights the howls were loudest, when certain animals prowled, and how the quiet of the wild could mean safety or signal an unseen threat. They were no longer just surviving in the dark. They were reading it, mapping it, and slowly they were mastering it. And yet, for all their skill, the night was never truly theirs. The darkness remained a place of danger, a realm that belonged to the wild. But by keeping watch, by guarding one another through the long hours between dusk and dawn, humans endured it. They became the creatures who stayed when others fled, who stood their ground when the world went black. Each sunrise was a victory. Every time the Watchers saw dawn break, they knew they had survived another night. And with every night that passed, they learned more, growing not only more cautious but more capable. The predators never left, but humans became something new, the ones who watched back. This constant battle with the dark taught them a lesson that went far beyond the night. Survival was not only about strength or even tools, it was about vigilance, memory, and the will to keep going even when fear never went away. And from those long, watchful nights came the first true foundation of human endurance. The knowledge that danger would always be there, but so would they. As they sat around their fires, weapons within reach, and eyes fixed on the shifting dark, they began to do something else as well, something that had nothing to do with fear at all. They started to mark the world around them, to leave signs and shapes on stone, to draw the things they saw in the firelight and in their dreams. Because after learning to watch the night, they learned to see it, and then they began to paint it. In the safety of their shelters, with fires burning low and the night kept at bay by watchful eyes, humans began to do something unexpected. They started to draw. It was not food, fire, or weapons. It did not keep them warm or chase away predators. And yet, in caves deep beneath the earth and on walls lit only by flickering flames, they marked the world around them. At first, the images were simple. The shape of an animal, the outline of a hand, crude lines scratched into stone. But even these first marks carried weight. They were not random, they were deliberate. Someone chose to pick up a piece of charcoal or a shard of coloured mineral and press it against the rock. In that moment, survival stopped being only about the next hunt or the next storm. It became about memory. These drawings were more than decoration. They were records. A herd of bison carved into the walls of a cave might have been a reminder of where the animals were last seen, or an attempt to pass that knowledge to others. A series of dots might have represented the passage of days or the phases of the moon. Each line was a message, even if its meaning has been blurred by time. For those who made them, the walls became something more than stone. They became a way to speak to the future. Some of these images were astonishingly detailed. In the caves of places like Lascaux and Chauvet, painted thousands of years apart, the animals almost seemed to move. Horses gallop across the walls, their bodies layered in strokes of ochre and charcoal. Mammoths lumber in dark reds and browns. These are not clumsy sketches. They are observations rendered with care. Whoever made them watched these creatures closely. They knew how muscles shifted when an animal ran, how horns curved, how eyes glimmered in the firelight. These drawings are proof of an attention to the world that went beyond survival. But why draw at all? Some believe these images were a kind of instruction, a visual language passed between generations. A child might learn to recognize the outline of a deer or the shape of a bison before ever seeing one in the wild. Others think the drawings had a deeper purpose, one rooted not only in knowledge but in belief. Perhaps painting a successful hunt was a way of willing it into existence, a ritual to tip the odds in favor of the hunters. There may have been something else at work as well. In the glow of firelight, those images must have seemed alive. Shadows danced across the uneven walls, making the painted animals shift and flicker as if they were moving through the stone itself. It was the first kind of magic, an illusion born from light, imagination, and the human need to see meaning in everything. And yet, these paintings were not only about animals or hunts. Among the images there are handprints, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them pressed against the walls. Some are small, the size of a child's palm. Others are larger, rougher, the hands of adults who had survived countless winters. Each one was a declaration, I was here. In a world where life was short and uncertain, these marks were proof that someone had lived, that their hand had touched the stone, and that they had left a piece of themselves behind. These early artists were not working alone. Groups likely gathered in the deep parts of the caves, carrying torches to push back the darkness as they painted. The smell of smoke filled the air, and the sound of tools scraping against stone mixed with quiet voices. In those moments, something new was happening. Humans were not just surviving together, they were creating together. Art, even in this earliest form, was a kind of shared language that required no words. A painted mammoth needed no translation. A line of handprints spoke for itself. These marks became a way for the group to see their world not just as it was, but as they understood it. This was not just a distraction or a way to pass the time. It was part of what made humans human. The same minds that sharpened stones and tracked herds were now shaping symbols. They were no longer only reacting to the world, they were beginning to interpret it. Every mark on the wall was a step towards something greater, a way of thinking that looked beyond the immediate needs of hunger and shelter and into the vast, mysterious idea of meaning itself. The caves also became places of memory. Imagine a child being led by torchlight into a space where the walls were covered in animals and handprints. They would not need to be told what it meant. The weight of it would be in the air, in the silence that must have filled those places, in the sense that these marks were more than pictures. They were a conversation across time, a reminder that they belonged to a story that had begun long before they were born. And as these images multiplied, they began to connect people not only to each other but to the world around them. Painting an animal was a way of seeing it, of knowing it more deeply. It forced the painter to study every curve, every line, every movement. In doing so, humans were not just recording the world, they were learning it, committing it to memory in a way that sharpened their understanding of everything they depended on. Even today, those paintings endure. They remain deep in the caves, untouched by the centuries, silent witnesses to the minds that first imagined something more than mere survival. They are a reminder that long before farming or writing or the first cities, humans were already reaching for something beyond the next meal or the next night. But while they painted, while they marked their presence on stone, life outside the caves went on. The wind still howled, the cold still bit at their skin, and sooner or later they had to leave the shelter of their painted walls and face the wild again. Because for all their growing creativity, their lives still depended on one simple truth. No matter how clever or careful they became, the world would not wait for them. It would change, and they would have to follow. As humans painted the walls of their caves and sharpened their tools by firelight, their lives were still defined by movement. They followed the seasons, the herds, and the shifting rhythms of the land. But over time, something began to change. Slowly, in certain places, the endless wandering gave way to something new, the first signs of staying put. The earliest villages were not the villages we think of today. There were no streets, no fences, and no permanent houses. They were simply places where humans returned again and again, drawn by safety, food, or water. A bend in a river that teemed with fish. A grove where wild fruit ripened each season. A stretch of open land where herds passed predictably. These places became more than temporary camps. They became familiar ground. When groups began to return to the same locations, their shelters grew sturdier. Instead of flimsy windbreaks or quickly assembled lean-tos, they built structures that could last longer. Hides stretched over heavy frames, walls reinforced with branches, stones stacked in rough circles to anchor their homes against the wind. These early dwellings were still simple, but they marked a shift in how humans saw the land. It was no longer just a backdrop for survival. It was something they could shape. Living in one place, even for a season, changed everything. Fires no longer had to be rebuilt from nothing each night. They could be kept burning for weeks. Tools could be stored instead of carried from place to place. Food, when it was plentiful, could be dried or smoked and saved for leaner times. This new rhythm gave humans something they had never truly had before, a buffer against uncertainty. But with this change came new challenges. Staying in one place meant that waste and food scraps attracted animals. It meant that larger groups had to share space without scattering too far. It meant that predators learned where to find them. Humans adapted by organising themselves more carefully. They placed their shelters in clusters, built fires close enough for their light to overlap, and assigned watchers to guard the edges of the camp. The beginnings of community were born not out of choice, but necessity. And with community came connection. In these early settlements, knowledge spread more quickly. A skilled toolmaker could teach others in the group, and their techniques would not be lost when the group moved on. Hunters could share what they had learned about the land or the habits of prey. Those who were injured or weak were no longer left behind so easily. They could be cared for within the safety of the camp. The first villages also brought with them something else: time. With the group gathered in one place, some could focus on tasks other than the immediate hunt or harvest. While some hunted, others repaired tools, tanned hides, or maintained the fires. Work became divided not just by need, but by skill. Each person had a role, and together those roles supported the survival of the whole. The land itself began to bear the marks of this new way of life. Paths formed where feet had walked the same routes again and again. Hearths blackened the ground where fires had burned in the same spots for months. Bones and discarded tools piled up in the soil, creating the first traces of what would one day be called settlements. These places were not yet permanent, but they were no longer fleeting either. They were something in between, a bridge between the wandering life and the world that was coming. And even as they stayed in one place longer, humans learned to defend it. They built barriers from branches or stacked stones to form rough walls. They cleared the ground around their shelters so they could see predators approaching. For the first time, the wild was pushed back, even if only by a few paces. Each small improvement turned the camp into a place that felt less like borrowed ground and more like a claim. Yet the first villages were not only practical, they became the heart of something deeper. In the glow of many fires burning close together, humans gathered not just for safety but for company. They shared stories of the hunt. They taught children what to fear and what to follow. They laughed, argued, and mourned. These gatherings were more than survival. They were the first sparks of society, fragile but undeniable. As groups lingered in these places, they formed attachments. A bend in the river was no longer just a source of fish. It was the place where a child had taken their first steps, where a successful hunt had been celebrated, where fires had burned through long winters. These memories tied humans to the land in ways they had never experienced before. And with every season that brought them back, the camps grew. A few more shelters, a larger fire, more hands to build, hunt, and watch the night. Over time, these clusters became something new. Not just camps, but villages. Still simple, still temporary, but with roots that sank a little deeper each year. This was not the end of the wandering life. Not yet. There were still migrations, still long journeys across unfamiliar ground. But the first villages were proof that humans were beginning to bend the world to their needs. For the first time, they were not simply moving through the land, they were starting to belong to it. And within these villages, around those shared fires and in the company of others, something else quietly evolved. As humans gathered and worked together, they found new ways not only to survive, but to heal each other when survival came at a cost. Life in the first villages gave humans a measure of security, but security did not erase danger. Injuries were constant. A hunt gone wrong might leave a deep cut or a broken bone. A careless step in the dark could mean a twisted ankle or worse. Illness came with the seasons, fevers that burned, coughs that lingered, and infections that crept silently through the body. In a world without doctors, medicine, or even an understanding of why the body failed, survival often depended on what could be done with bare hands, simple tools, and the knowledge passed down from those who had lived through it before. The earliest form of healing was not skill, but instinct. When someone was hurt, others reached for them. They pressed hands to wounds to stop the bleeding. They wrapped injuries with whatever was at hand, strips of hide, grass fibres or softened bark. They learned that cold water eased pain, that rest was necessary, and that the warmth of the group could mean the difference between recovery and death. Healing began not with knowledge, but with care. Over time, these instincts turned into something more deliberate. Humans noticed patterns. They saw which plants soothed and which ones poisoned. A bitter-tasting root might ease pain. A crushed leaf might calm swelling. Smoke from certain woods might clear breathing, while others made it worse. These lessons were never written down. They lived in memory, carried in the minds of those who had seen what worked and what didn't, then shared in hushed words around the fire. The hands that hunted and built shelters also became the first tools of medicine. Fingers traced the edges of wounds to clean away dirt. Palms pressed against foreheads to measure fever by touch alone. Bones and hides were used as splints for broken limbs, lashed tightly with sinew or plant fibres. Every action was practical, born from necessity rather than knowledge of the body's inner workings. Yet even without understanding why these things worked, early humans learned that they often did. Pain was a teacher, and so was survival. If a treatment saved a life, it was remembered. If it failed, it was abandoned. Over generations, this trial and error became a kind of living medicine. In every group, there were those who remembered the most, elders who had seen countless injuries and illnesses and could recall what had helped before. These people became the first healers, not because of any title, but because others turned to them when fear and pain demanded answers. Healing was not only about the body, comfort mattered too. A hand resting on a shoulder, a low hum of reassurance or a quiet word of hope could steady a person enough to endure pain. Even without knowing why, humans discovered that care itself could help the wounded survive. Those who were tended to were more likely to fight for their lives than those left alone. In this way, healing was never just treatment. It was connection. The first medicines came from the land. Plants provided leaves to crush into pastes, roots to chew for relief, and resins to seal wounds. Some groups burned aromatic herbs in their shelters, believing the smoke would drive out sickness. Others learned that clay could cool burns or that salt from dried riverbeds could clean a wound. These discoveries came slowly, but each one was carried forward, shared from one mouth to another until it became part of how humans lived. Even the dead taught lessons. A hunter who died of an infected wound left behind knowledge for those who watched it happen. A fever that swept through a village taught survivors which remedies brought even the smallest relief. Suffering carved memory into the minds of those who endured it, and memory was passed on. Healing also demanded cooperation. When a hunter was injured, others had to take their place until he could recover. When a mother fell ill, the group cared for her children until she returned to strength. Illness and injury were never borne alone. They rippled outward, and the group absorbed the weight together. This shared burden was not just survival strategy. It was the first sign of something larger, a sense of responsibility for one another. Around the fire, healing became ritual. Wounds were washed, herbs applied, and bones set with steady hands. Children watched and learned. Each act of care was a lesson, and each lesson was a step towards something greater. The understanding that survival was not only about strength or speed, but about knowledge and compassion. Even in the harshest conditions, these small victories mattered. A broken bone that healed straight meant a hunter could return to the chase. A fever that passed meant another pair of hands to gather food. Every life saved strengthened the group as a whole, and slowly, as these lessons accumulated, humans became not only hunters, gatherers and builders, they became healers too. The world around them remained dangerous, but now they had ways to endure its cost. They had fire for warmth, shelters for safety, tools for defense, and hands that could mend what the wild sought to break. And with every wound treated and every sickness survived, they grew more certain that they could outlast not just the night, but the endless test the world would place before them. Yet even healing, as vital as it was only one piece of the struggle. The land itself had its own rhythms, seasons of abundance and seasons of scarcity. And if humans were to endure, they would have to learn those rhythms as well as they learned the use of their tools or the language of their voices. The world of the Stone Age was not constant. It shifted with the seasons, and each change brought new challenges. Humans had no calendars, no clocks, no written records to track the passing of time. They learned the year not through numbers but through the land itself. The length of the days, the angle of the sun, the smell of the air, and the behaviour of animals. Survival depended on reading these signs and adapting before the world turned against them. Spring was a time of renewal. After long, bitter winters, the snow melted, rivers swelled, and the land stirred back to life. Plants pushed through the soil, and animals that had vanished during the cold months returned to graze. For humans, spring meant movement. Camps were abandoned as groups followed the fresh growth, seeking new food sources. Hunters watched the trails of returning herds, while gatherers searched for the first edible shoots and berries. It was a time of abundance, but it was also a time of work. If they were to survive the next winter, they had to take advantage of every moment while the world was generous. Summer brought both comfort and danger. With long days and warm nights, food was plentiful, rivers teemed with fish, and the forests were heavy with fruit. But summer also carried risks. Heat dried up water sources, forcing groups to travel farther. Insects swarmed and carried disease. Predators were at their strongest, well-fed and fearless, competing with humans for the same prey. To endure summer, humans had to be clever. They learned to store food in shaded pits or hang it high where scavengers could not reach. They rose early to hunt before the heat pressed down and saved their energy for the cooler hours of dusk. Every season was a lesson in timing, and in summer those lessons came quickly. Autumn was different. It was the season of preparation. Humans understood, even without counting the days, that the world was about to change. The herds grew restless and began to migrate, moving toward winter grazing grounds. Plants withered and died back into the soil. The air grew sharper, carrying the first hints of the cold to come. During these months, humans became tireless. They hunted more than they needed, drying and smoking meat to keep it from rotting. They gathered roots and nuts that would last through the frost. They patched their shelters, sealed the gaps, and laid in as much fuel for their fires as they could find. Then winter came, and with it, the most dangerous test of all. Food became scarce, and the cold gnawed at bone and muscle. Rivers froze, snow buried the land, the herds vanished into distant valleys, and the plants that had sustained them for months were gone. Winter was not a season to be conquered, it was a season to endure. In the deep cold, humans stayed close to their shelters, huddled near the fire. They relied on the food they had stored and the warmth of one another. The hunters who ventured out faced a world of silence and ice, where even the smallest mistake could mean death. They followed the tracks of starving animals, knowing that every kill could keep their families alive another week. And through it all, the fire burned. It was the thin line between life and the killing cold. But winter had its lessons too. It taught patience. It taught restraint. It forced humans to plan, to think ahead, to imagine a future beyond the frozen present. Every successful winter was proof that foresight mattered as much as strength, and those who survived carried that knowledge forward, turning it into the rhythm by which their lives were measured. Over generations, these seasonal patterns shaped the way humans lived. They became migratory not only because of the animals they hunted, but because they understood the land itself. They knew when rivers would flood, when fruit would ripen, and when snow would trap them in place. Their lives became a cycle, moving with the world instead of fighting it. Yet, this was more than survival. It was the beginning of a deeper connection to the earth. The land was no longer an unpredictable enemy. It was a teacher. Its seasons offered warnings and rewards. punishing those who failed to prepare and rewarding those who watched and remembered. Humans began to see the world not only in terms of what it gave them, but in how it changed, and in those changes they found a kind of order. Around the fires in winter, elders likely spoke of past seasons, when the herds had come late, when the cold had been harsher than usual, when food had been scarce or plentiful. These stories were not entertainment, they were maps of memory, guiding younger generations through the cycles they would face in their own lives. Every tale was a survival manual hidden inside a memory. The seasons gave humans more than knowledge. They gave them identity. They were no longer just wanderers reacting to what they found. They became planners, builders, and keepers of memory. They measured their lives not in days, but in the turning of the world itself. And with every passing year, one lesson became clearer. Survival was not only about adapting to the world, it was about adapting to one another. The long winters and the hard summers bound humans closer together, teaching them that cooperation was not optional. It was the only way forward. That cooperation would soon become something far greater. It would turn scattered families into tightly knit groups, and those groups into tribes bound by trust, memory, and the shared will to endure. The seasons shaped how humans lived, but it was one another who shaped how they survived. Alone, a person stood no chance against the world of the Stone Age. A single hunter could not defend himself against a predator, carry enough food for the winter, or keep a fire burning through long nights. Survival was not an individual task. It was something built on the strength of many, and from that necessity came the bonds of the tribe. A tribe was more than a group of families. It was a web of trust and shared responsibility. Every member had a role to play. The strongest hunters brought down the largest game, while others carried, prepared, and preserved it. Skilled toolmakers chipped stone edges sharper than teeth, crafting blades and points that the hunters relied on. Elders, no longer fast enough to chase prey, became the memory of the tribe. They carried the knowledge of past winters, dangerous trails, and the places where food could be found when everything else was gone. Children grew in this world surrounded by watchful eyes. They learned to walk not only under the care of their parents, but under the quiet guidance of the entire tribe. They watched how to hold a stone, how to throw a spear, how to listen for danger in the wind. They were not taught in lessons the way we think of teaching now. They learned by watching, by copying, by living every day in the presence of those who had survived before them. Around the fire, the tribe became more than a collection of individuals. It became a single living unit, bound together by shared struggle. Food was not kept for one, it was divided. A successful hunt was celebrated by all, and a failed hunt was endured by all. In this way, survival became a collective effort, and trust was not a luxury. It was the foundation that held the tribe together. Conflict surely existed. Even in the earliest days, hunger and fear could bring out anger. But in the face of the vast, merciless wilderness, cooperation mattered more than pride. When danger loomed, whether from predators, storms, or rival groups, disputes gave way to unity. The bonds of the tribe were not perfect, but they were strong enough to endure because they had to be. These bonds were reinforced not only by necessity but by ritual. Shared meals around the fire were more than a way to eat. They were a way to be reminded that no one stood alone. Stories passed from elders to children served as both memory and warning, tying each new generation to the hardships and triumphs of the ones before it. Every tale of survival was a thread woven into the fabric of the tribe, reminding everyone that they belonged to something greater than themselves. Even grief was shared. When someone died, their absence was felt not by one or two but by all. The tribe carried that weight together, and in doing so they learned another kind of strength, the strength to keep going even when loss cut deep. Every fire lit after such moments, every hunt taken up in spite of sorrow, was proof that no single life stood apart. They endured as one. The tribe was also the first defense against the unknown. In a world where danger could come from any direction, No one could watch every shadow alone. But with many eyes and many hands, the tribe became a living shield. Hunters stood guard while others slept. When predators came too close, the tribe fought them off together, their spears and voices turning fear into something fierce and unyielding. And within these bonds, something else began to grow: identity. A person was not only an individual, they were part of a group that had its own ways of hunting, its own places of shelter, its own stories about the world. These differences mark the earliest beginnings of culture. Each tribe carried with it a unique thread of human history, shaped by the land they walked and the lives they led. Cooperation also allowed for specialization. Not everyone had to be a hunter or a gatherer at all times. Those with the sharpest eyes for tracking prey could lead the hunt. Those with steady hands could focus on crafting tools. Those with long memories could pass down the knowledge of plants, seasons, and dangers that could not be seen until it was too late. No single person could master everything, but the tribe could. And with this came security unlike anything humans had known before. A lone person might falter, a tribe endured. When one was sick, others cared for them. When one was injured, others hunted in their place. When one was lost, others carried their memory forward in stories told by the fire. The bonds of the tribe turned survival into something shared, and in that sharing, humans found their first true strength. But these bonds did more than keep them alive. They laid the foundation for the world to come. Cooperation was not simply a strategy, it became part of what it meant to be human. The instincts forged in those early tribes, trust, loyalty, and the willingness to work together, would shape every step of our journey out of the Stone Age. And as these tribes sat close to their fires, as the sparks rose into the dark sky, they worked not only to keep the night at bay, but to carve their place in it. With tools in their hands and fire at their side, they turned their focus to something that would change them yet again: the tools themselves, and how they would evolve from simple stones into instruments of mastery. The bonds of the tribe gave humans strength in numbers, but their true power came from what they could make with their hands. Stone and bone became the building blocks of survival, each one shaped not only by necessity, but by the quiet ingenuity that had been growing since the first sharp edge was struck from a rock. With every tool they crafted, humans pushed a little further from the life of mere endurance, and closer to a future where the world could be reshaped to their will. The first tools of stone were simple, flakes chipped from a larger rock, sharp enough to slice meat or scrape a hide. But over generations, these crude edges evolved. Hunters learned to strike stones at precise angles, creating points that were sharper and more durable. They discovered that some stones, like flint or obsidian, fractured in predictable ways, producing razor-thin edges that could cut cleanly through flesh and sinew. These were not accidents anymore, they were choices, born from observation and memory. Bone, too, became a resource. At first, it was only what remained after a meal, discarded fragments from the skeletons of prey. But then humans saw its potential. A sharpened rib or splintered femur could pierce as well as stone. A hollow bone could serve as a container, a whistle, or even the shaft for a weapon. Where other creatures left bones to rot, humans turned them into tools. With stone and bone together, a new kind of toolkit emerged. Stone blades cut hides into clothing, while bone needles pierced them for stitching. Stone axes brought down branches and split wood for fuel, while bone awls punched holes in leather and bark. The tribe was no longer limited to what their bare hands could manage. Their tools became extensions of their will. This transformation was not just practical, it was intellectual. Tool-making required imagination. A person holding a raw piece of flint had to see what it could become before it existed. They had to strike with purpose, knowing that the wrong blow could ruin hours of work. Each tool was a lesson in cause and effect, a quiet education in how the world could be shaped. Children learned this skill by watching the elders work. They saw the patient tapping of stone against stone, the way flakes were turned and examined before another strike was made. They learned to hold their breath at the moment of impact, waiting for the sound that meant a clean fracture. These lessons were passed not in words but in action, each motion repeated until it became instinct. Bone tools brought even greater refinement. Unlike stone, bone was lighter and could be shaped into fine points. Hunters began using bone-tipped spears that could strike deeper and truer. Fishhooks carved from bone allowed humans to pull food from rivers and lakes without relying solely on the hunt. Scrapers made from rib bones thinned hides until they were soft enough to wrap around the body. The tools themselves were not the only change. Their existence reshaped how humans lived. With sharp edges and sturdy points, they could hunt larger game more efficiently. A single kill could feed the tribe for days, freeing time for other tasks. With bone needles, they could stitch clothing tight enough to keep out the bitter cold, making it possible to survive in places they once could not. And every new tool carried with it a ripple of progress. Better weapons made hunting safer. Better clothing made travel easier. Better containers, made from bone, hide, or hollowed wood, allowed food to be carried farther and stored longer. Each improvement opened new possibilities, and each possibility pushed humans deeper into lands that would once have been unreachable. In the evenings by the fire, tools were repaired and sharpened. The sound of stone being struck against stone or bones scraping against rock filled the quiet between the flicker of flames. These were not only the sounds of survival, they were the sounds of thought, of hands shaping a future one edge at a time. But tools were not just functional. Some were made with a care that went beyond what was necessary. Certain bone points were smoothed and polished until they gleamed. Some stones were chipped into shapes that were almost artistic, their balance and symmetry far beyond what simple survival required. This hinted at something new, pride, even beauty in the things humans made. These objects also held meaning. A finely crafted spear could be passed from one generation to the next. A bone pendant might be worn not only as decoration but as a symbol of skill or status. Tools, once only instruments of necessity, became part of how humans saw themselves and each other. And with every new tool, humans grew bolder. They began to venture into harsher climates, armed with better weapons and sturdier clothing. They faced larger prey and built stronger shelters. What began with a simple chipped rock had become a revolution, and stone and bone were at the centre of it. But the world was still vast, and the challenges ahead were many. For every tool they made, new problems appeared. The land shifted, the climate changed, herds moved and predators adapted. Survival was never something won, it was something fought for every single day. And yet, with stone and bone in their hands, humans had what they needed to keep pushing forward. They had the means to endure, to adapt, and to face the unknown. Because soon, those tools would not only help them hunt and build, they would give them the courage to face the greatest beasts that walked the earth, the massive creatures that towered over them, the ones that tested every ounce of strength and every spark of ingenuity they possessed. With sharper tools in their hands and the strength of the tribe at their backs, humans turned their eyes toward the greatest challenge of the Stone Age, the giants of their world. Mammoths, bison, and other massive beasts roamed the plains in herds that seemed endless. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and powerful enough to crush a person beneath their feet with no effort at all. And yet, they were also a promise. One successful hunt could feed an entire tribe, clothe them through the winter, and provide bones and sinew for tools. Chasing giants was never safe, but it was necessary. The hunt began long before the first spear was thrown. It started with observation. Tribes learned the patterns of these colossal animals, their migration routes, their feeding grounds, the seasons when their movements slowed. They watched from a distance, sometimes for days, marking where a herd rested and how the wind carried their scent. Patience was as much a weapon as any spear. To rush was to fail, and failure against such prey meant more than hunger. It meant death. When the moment came, the hunt was a test of unity. No single hunter could face a mammoth or bring down a bison alone. These creatures were too strong, too large, and too dangerous. But a coordinated tribe could turn the hunt into strategy. Some would circle wide to drive the animals forward. Others would wait with spears poised, ready to strike from the flanks. The fire-hardened points of their weapons, tipped with stone or bone, flashed in the sun as they closed in. The air during these hunts must have been electric. Fear and determination knotted together in every heartbeat. One wrong step, one mistimed throw, and the prey could turn on them. A charging mammoth was not merely an animal, it was a living wall of muscle and bone that could scatter hunters like leaves in the wind. And yet, they stood their ground. Sometimes, the land itself became their ally. Tribes learned to drive the great beast toward ravines or trap them in bogs where their size became a disadvantage. They used fire to steer herds, waving torches and shouting until the animals bolted in the direction the hunters wanted. In this way, intelligence outweighed sheer strength. The humans were small, but they were cunning, and against the giants, cunning was enough. When a beast finally fell, it was not the end of the hunt. It was the beginning of the work. Dozens of hands moved at once, cutting, stripping, and hauling away everything the animal offered. The hide was thick and heavy, enough to cover shelters or stitch into clothing that could keep out the worst winter wind. The bones became spears, scrapers, and frames for homes. Even the sinew was saved, twisted into strong cords that could tie weapons or bind wounds. Nothing was wasted. For a tribe, a single successful hunt was more than food. It was survival secured for weeks, sometimes months. Bellies would be full, fires would burn brighter, and spirits would rise. Children would eat the choicest cuts, and the elders would be fed in gratitude for their guidance. In these moments, the tribe celebrated not only the kill, but their own unity. They had faced something vast and terrifying together, and they had won. Yet the risks were always there. Not every hunt succeeded. Sometimes the giants escaped, vanishing into the horizon faster than the hunters could follow. Other times, the hunters returned bloodied or not at all. Every attempt carried the knowledge that this could be the one that cost them more than it gave. And still, they hunted. Hunger left no other choice. The hunt for giants shaped the human mind as much as it shaped the human body. It taught discipline, coordination, and the power of planning. It demanded courage, but it rewarded those who could think, adapt, and work together. These hunts were not just battles between man and beast. They were lessons, each one carving the memory of survival into the bones of the tribe. Around the fire, after the danger had passed, the stories of these hunts were told and retold. Children sat wide-eyed as they listened to the elders describe the charge of a mammoth or the moment a spear struck true. These stories were not only for pride, they were training. Every word prepared the next generation for the day they would join the chase themselves. Even the land bore witness to these hunts. Scattered across ancient plains are the remains of mammoth bones arranged in ways that suggest more than chance. Circles and patterns that may have been the foundations of shelters or the marks of ritual. These remnants speak of a world where survival was written in both blood and ingenuity, where every hunt left an imprint not only on the people, but on the very earth they walked. And as the tribes learned to hunt the giants, they learned something else. They were no longer just surviving in their world, they were shaping it. They were predators unlike any other, small in size but armed with tools, fire, and a mind sharp enough to bring down creatures many times their strength. But in hunting these massive beasts, they also became students of the wild. They saw how the animals moved, how they fed, how the changing seasons guided their paths. In the shadow of the giants, humans learned to watch not only for prey, but for the subtle lessons the world offered every day. And those lessons the quiet teachings of wind, water and earth, would become their next advantage, because soon survival would no longer be about the strength of their spears alone. It would depend on the knowledge they gathered from the world itself, and the wisdom they carried forward into every hunt, every shelter, and every fire they lit against the dark. Every hunt, every season, every long night spent by the fire taught humans something. But their greatest teachers were not the giants they brought down, or even the tools they shaped. Their greatest teachers were the world itself, the quiet, constant forces that surrounded them. The wind, the rivers, the stars, and the shifting patterns of the land spoke to those who knew how to watch and listen. For humans to survive, they had to become students of the earth. Long before they ever farmed or built permanent homes, they understood that nature had a rhythm. The position of the sun told them when the day was ending. The chill in the air whispered of coming frost. The calls of migrating birds carried warnings of changing seasons. None of these lessons were written down. They were learned in silence, passed from one generation to the next in gestures, stories, and the watchful gaze of those who had survived longer than the rest. The sky was one of their first guides. By day, the sun's path across the horizon became a clock without numbers. By night, the stars offered a map. Humans noticed how certain constellations appeared only during specific times of year. They followed them like signposts, using them to track the seasons and to know when it was time to move with the herds or return to familiar grounds where food would be waiting. Without charts or instruments, they learned to navigate by memory and instinct, guided by the same lights that still burn above us today. The land itself was another teacher. Hunters read the ground as though it were a language. A bent blade of grass or a shallow print in the mud told them which way an animal had gone. A broken branch revealed not only direction but size and speed. They learned to feel the earth beneath their feet, to know if it was soft with recent rain or hard from drought, and what that meant for the animals that depended on it. Even the wind carried knowledge. Its direction could betray their presence to prey or bring the scent of predators to their camp before danger was close enough to see. To ignore it was to invite disaster, but to use it was to turn the unseen into an advantage. Hunters crouched low and moved against the wind, invisible to the noses of the creatures they stalked. This was not guesswork. It was skill, honed by generations of trial and error until it became instinct. Water, too, spoke its own language. The level of a river told them how much snow had melted far away. The taste of a stream revealed whether it was safe to drink. They learned that fish gathered in calm pools, that animals carved trails leading to watering holes, and that where water flowed, life followed. These were not small discoveries. In a world without wells or stored supplies, knowing the ways of water was as important as knowing how to breathe. Plants were their quiet allies and their silent threats. Some healed, some killed. A single mistake in choosing the wrong route or berry could end a life. But those who watched closely learned which leaves soothed wounds, which bark eased pain, and which herbs drove sickness away. They learned through observation, yes, but also through the terrible cost of failure. Every remedy was written in memory, paid for with the suffering of those who came before. Animals too taught them. Even those they did not hunt offered lessons. Birds took flight in sudden bursts, warning of unseen predators. Wolves and other scavengers led them to fresh kills that could be scavenged for meat. The behaviour of prey animals, when they grazed, where they rested, how they fled, became a map of survival, etched into the minds of every hunter who lived long enough to pass it on. From these lessons grew a kind of wisdom that was not loud or obvious. It was not the knowledge of tools or fire, but the knowledge of balance. Humans learned that to fight the world blindly was to lose. To live, they had to move with it, hunting when prey was plenty, retreating when storms raged, and conserving strength when the land grew lean. This harmony was not peace, but it was understanding, and that understanding gave them power. The elders of each tribe became the keepers of this wisdom. They remembered which valleys flooded in the spring, which groves bore fruit in late summer, and which paths the herds followed when the cold pressed in. Around the fire, they spoke of these things not as instructions, but as stories, weaving survival into memory so the young would listen. In this way, every hunt, every storm, every hardship became a lesson that would outlive those who first endured it. These quiet teachers did more than keep humans alive. They sharpened their minds. Every pattern they noticed, every small sign they followed, was a step towards seeing the world not just as it was, but as something that could be read and understood. Over time, that understanding would grow into something even greater. The first spark of curiosity about why these patterns existed at all. But for now, the lessons were simple and immediate. The wind, the stars, the rivers, and the tracks in the mud were enough. They spoke a language older than words, and humans, patient and watchful, learned to listen. And listening was what would carry them into the next challenge. A challenge that came not from the sky or the rivers or the herds, but from the world itself changing beneath their feet. Because there would come a time when the cold deepened, when the land shifted, and when survival would depend not only on knowledge, but on the will to endure a world transformed. The world was never still. Even as humans learned the language of the wind, the stars, and the rivers, the earth itself could change in ways that no tribe could ignore. Ice crept across the land. Forests shifted into open plains. Animals that once roamed in abundance vanished or moved to places far beyond familiar trails. When the world changed, humans had to change with it, or be left behind. The ice ages came slowly, but their impact was relentless. Cold spread across vast regions, turning fertile lands into frozen wastelands where nothing grew. Rivers locked under sheets of ice, and snow blanketed the ground for months at a time. The great herds moved south, seeking food and warmth, and the tribes followed. Migration was no longer just a choice, it was survival. These journeys were long and brutal. Entire groups walked for weeks or even months, carrying only what they could. They followed the tracks of animals, watching the skies for signs of weather, and trusting in the memory of their elders who had walked these paths before. Every step was a gamble. A wrong turn could lead to empty lands or frozen death. But those who moved with the herds lived, and those who stayed behind vanished with the snow. The cold forced humans to innovate. Hides were no longer enough. They had to be sewn into thicker layers, stitched tightly to keep out the wind. Shelters were reinforced, dug deeper, and sometimes even built partially underground to trap what little warmth could be found. Fires were fed constantly, guarded like living things, because losing them in the middle of winter could be fatal. The hunt changed too. Many of the animals that had once been easy prey either migrated or disappeared entirely. In their place came new challenges, larger, stronger, and better adapted to the cold. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses became both prize and peril, their size enough to feed a tribe for weeks, but also enough to crush anyone who faced them without caution. Hunting them required not only courage but strategy and cooperation on a scale greater than ever before. But cold was not the only change. As ice advanced in some places, it retreated in others. Land bridges opened where oceans had once stood, connecting distant continents for the first time in human history. New territories became reachable, and with them came fresh opportunities and dangers. The world was no longer a single familiar place. It was vast, shifting, and full of unknown horizons. Tribes that once roamed the same valleys for generations began to move farther than ever before. They crossed frozen tundras and followed coastlines, adapting to new landscapes and learning new ways to survive. In each new place, the world taught them fresh lessons: how to fish from icy waters, how to track animals across snow, how to gather plants that had never grown in their old lands. Migration became not just survival, it became transformation. These changes shaped not only how humans lived, but who they were. In the face of shifting climates and vanishing resources, the tribes that endured were the ones that adapted the fastest. They shared knowledge freely, relied on one another, and passed down the wisdom of their journeys. The world was harsh, but it was also a teacher, forcing them to grow stronger, smarter, and more connected than ever before. And in this constant movement, humans began to spread. Some followed the coasts, learning to harvest the sea. Others pressed inland, mastering forests and rivers. Some braved the bitter cold of northern lands, while others thrived in the warmth of southern plains. Each path carved a different way of life, but all were bound by the same truth. No matter how the earth shifted, humans would not stop moving. This ability to adapt, to pick up and leave when the world demanded it, was what kept them alive. Other creatures were bound to their environments, but humans were not. They carried their tools, their fire, their knowledge, and their will across every new horizon. Where one place failed them, another waited. The world could change as much as it wanted. They would change with it. Yet the ice and the shifting land did more than test their endurance. They sparked something deeper, a sense of wonder, to see the sun rise over a frozen plain, to watch herds vanish into a white horizon, to stand at the edge of an ocean where the land itself had pulled back. These were moments that left their mark. In those moments, humans were no longer just surviving. They were witnessing the vastness of the world for the first time, and it was in that vastness that another transformation began to take shape. As they travelled farther and endured more, they carried not only tools and fire, but also ideas, beliefs that would grow stronger around their fires at night. For when the world was so large and unpredictable, they began to search for meaning within it. And in that search, something new was born. Rituals and stories whispered by firelight, early glimpses of a need that ran deeper than food or shelter, the need to understand why they were here at all. When the world was vast, cold, and often merciless, humans gathered close to their fires not only for warmth but for something deeper. The flames crackled, throwing long shadows against the walls of their shelters, and in that glow they began to wonder. They had learned to hunt, to build, to travel, and to endure, but as they sat together and watched the sparks drift upward into the dark, they faced questions that tools and fire alone could not answer. The fire became more than heat and light. It was a centre, a place where the tribe came together not just to eat and plan, but to think and imagine. In those quiet hours, when the dangers of the day were behind them and the night stretched wide and silent, they told stories. Some were simple memories of hunts and journeys. Others were something different, explanations for the unexplainable, words shaped into meaning for a world that was still far too large to fully understand. The wind was not only wind, it carried voices. The stars were not only lights in the sky, they were watchful eyes. The earth, the rivers, the animals. They were more than resources. They were living forces, powerful and mysterious, and humans spoke of them with respect, fear, or gratitude. These ideas did not come from books or rules. They came from the firelight, from the way the world pressed in around them and demanded that they find a way to live in it without being consumed by it. Rituals were born here, in the glow of those flames. A hunter might whisper a word of thanks to the spirit of the animal he had killed. A mother might press her hand to the sky before a long journey, asking for safe passage. Some tribes painted symbols on stones or on their own skin, marks that carried meaning even if no one could explain why. These acts were not only habit, they were an attempt to bring order to a world that was wild and unpredictable. The fire itself became sacred. It drove back the dark, it warmed frozen hands, and it kept predators away. Without it, the night was a void. With it, there was hope. To let the fire die was unthinkable. Its light was life, and so it was tended carefully, almost reverently. Someone always stayed awake to feed it. Children learned from the moment they could walk that fire was not only survival, it was a force that demanded respect. Beliefs grew with every passing season. when storms tore through the land, when prey vanished without warning, or when sickness struck the tribe, these moments were not meaningless. They were signs. Perhaps the spirits were angry. Perhaps they were testing the tribe. Whatever the answer, the fire became the place where those questions were spoken aloud, where people sought comfort not only in warmth, but in the sense that there was something larger watching over them. Around the flames, elders became more than keepers of memory. They became the voices that shaped these early beliefs. They told of times when the world had been harsher, of hunts won against impossible odds, of strange lights in the sky or dreams that came true. Their words carried weight because they were not only stories, they were the threads that tied the tribe to something greater than their own lives. For the young, these stories were lessons. They learned not only where to find food or how to track an animal, but how to see the world as their ancestors did, alive, powerful, and full of meaning. They learned to bow their heads before the hunt, to offer the first piece of meat to the fire, or to trace a simple mark in the dirt for protection before they slept. These rituals were not superstition to them. They were survival woven into belief. Even the dead were not forgotten. Burials became more than a way to hide the smell from predators. Graves were marked with stones, and bodies were laid to rest with tools, weapons, or ornaments, as if the dead would need them in another world. This was not only grief, it was hope. Hope that life did not end in the cold ground, that those who had gone on still walked somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight. As the tribes moved across the land, these beliefs travelled with them. They shifted and changed like the wind, but the fire remained the same. No matter where they were, on a frozen plain, deep in a forest, or near the edge of a roaring sea, they gathered around it, and in its glow they reminded themselves that they were part of something bigger than the hunger and fear of their daily lives. These early beliefs gave humans strength in ways that food and shelter never could. They turned the unknown into something they could face. They gave meaning to suffering, purpose to rituals, and comfort to those who had lost. And though no one could prove that the spirits in the wind or the voices in the fire were real, what mattered was that they were believed. Belief was a kind of tool, just as vital as any spear or scraper. It held tribes together when the world threatened to tear them apart. It gave them courage to step into the dark, to face the cold, and to keep walking even when the horizon seemed endless. And in time, as humans learned to see the world not only through hunger and danger but through the lens of meaning and hope, they were ready for the next great shift. Because the same fire that warmed their hands and lit their stories would one day burn beside the first planted seeds, marking the beginning of something even greater than survival. The fire still burned, the hunt still fed the tribe, and the seasons still dictated every choice. But little by little, a quiet change was beginning. For generations, humans had lived by moving with the world, following the herds, gathering what the land offered, and leaving when it gave no more. Yet, as their hands grew more skilled and their minds sharper, they began to wonder if survival always had to depend on the chase. It started with observation. While foraging, they noticed that certain plants grew where seeds had fallen before. A patch of berries that had been plentiful one season often returned the next, not by chance, but because nature had repeated itself. They saw that animals left tracks not only in the earth but in the plants they disturbed, scattering seeds that sprouted in their wake. These were small details, but they were the kind of details humans never forgot. At first, it was not farming, it was encouragement. When they ate fruits, they left the seeds near their camps, and over time they saw that some of those seeds grew. When they found a grove rich in nuts or roots, they returned again and again, learning its rhythms, protecting it in subtle ways, even scaring off animals that might strip it bare. They were not yet planting, but they were beginning to shape the land without realizing it. The shift from stone to seed was not sudden. It happened slowly, across countless seasons and many tribes, each one adding a small piece to the knowledge passed down around the fire. They learned that if a patch of plants was not over-harvested, it would return stronger the next year. They learned that if seeds were scattered in the soil near camp, food might grow closer to home. What had once been wild chance was turning into a deliberate act, and with it, the first fragile roots of farming began to take hold. This was more than a new way of finding food. It was a new way of thinking. Hunting and gathering demanded constant movement. Planting required patience. It meant staying in one place long enough to see something grow. For the first time, humans had to imagine a future not only a day or a week away, but months ahead. They had to plan for a harvest they would not see until the seasons turned. Fire, tools, and the bonds of the tribe had taught them how to endure. Seeds taught them how to wait. And in that waiting, the world began to change. As humans scattered seeds and returned to the same patches of land, their camps became more permanent. Shelters grew sturdier. Hearths were rebuilt in the same spots, their stones blackened from years of smoke. Tribes that had once been restless wanderers began to linger longer. Slowly, the first signs of settlement appeared, born not from a decision, but from the quiet pull of the land itself. The animals followed too. Some, like wild goats and sheep, lingered near human camps to feed on scraps or forage in cleared areas. At first, they were only opportunistic visitors, but over time, humans saw the value in keeping them close. A single animal was food, but a herd was survival. They began to guide, protect, and even pen them, turning the hunt into something else entirely. A partnership between predator and prey that would change the shape of the world. But even in these early days, planting was not without risk. A bad season could wipe out a crop before it grew. Pests could strip the land bare. Storms could flatten fields in a single night. Hunting had been dangerous, but at least it offered quick answers. Either you caught your prey or you went hungry. Seeds demanded faith. They demanded trust in the unseen. And yet, the rewards were undeniable. A single successful harvest meant food that did not rot in days, but could be stored for months. It meant less wandering, fewer desperate hunts, and more time for everything else. Tool-making, shelter building, and even the quiet moments around the fire, where humans told their stories and imagined what might come next. From stone to seed, the shift was slow, but it was irreversible. Each generation added a little more to what the last had learned until, without ever intending it, they stepped across a line. They were no longer merely surviving at the mercy of the wild. They were beginning to shape it, and as they pressed seeds into the soil and watched the first green shoots rise, something else grew with them, a new sense of belonging. They were not only hunters or wanderers anymore, they were becoming something else. Settlers, builders, and keepers of the land. The world that had once pushed them endlessly forward was beginning to hold them in place, and for the first time in human history it seemed possible that the wild might not always be their master. Yet even with this new way of life taking root, they carried with them everything that had come before. The fire, the tools, the stories, the bonds of the tribe, and the memory of the countless ages they had spent chasing the world rather than shaping it. Because no matter how deep the first seeds were planted, the echoes of those earlier ages would never leave them. The first seeds were planted, the fires burned through the night, and the tribe stayed in one place longer than they ever had before. Yet even as humans began to shape the land, they carried with them the memory of every step that had brought them here. The echoes of the Stone Age were not left behind. They lived on, in the hands that built shelters, in the eyes that scanned the horizon, and in the instincts that had been carved into their bones by thousands of years of survival. Those echoes were in the fire, still guarded as if it were alive. Though humans no longer feared the night in the same way, they still gathered around its glow. They still felt its pull, the same warmth and comfort that had drawn their ancestors close when predators prowled just beyond the light. The fire was no longer only protection. It was a memory, a quiet reminder of a time when survival had depended on a single, steady flame. They were in the tools too. A polished blade or a well-shaped hammer was more than just a piece of stone or metal. It was the descendant of those first chipped rocks struck together in the dark. Every improvement carried the knowledge of the ones who had come before. Every edge a direct line back to the first human who had learned that a sharp stone could change the world. The echoes lived in the way humans moved across the land. Even as they settled and built the first permanent homes, they still walked old paths. They still followed rivers, crossed valleys, and looked to the sky for signs of the changing seasons. They may have learned to plant, but they never forgot how to read the earth, the stars, and the wind. The instincts of the hunter-gatherer lingered in every step. They were present in the stories told by the firelight. Long before there were words carved into clay or ink pressed onto parchment, there were voices. Elders spoke of the hunts, of the storm survived, of the great beasts that once roamed the earth. These stories were not only history, they were inheritance. In every tale, the living carried the dead forward, their knowledge and their struggles woven into the fabric of the tribe. And perhaps most of all, those echoes remained in the bonds between people. The tribe had been the first and most unbreakable truth of human life. Without it, no fire could have been kept alive, no hunt won, no child raised. Even as humans built villages and eventually cities, they carried that need for connection with them. They were never meant to survive alone. They had been shaped by a world that demanded unity, and that lesson was never forgotten. The Stone Age was not only a chapter in history, it was the foundation of what it means to be human. The patience learned from planting seeds, the vigilance learned from watching the night, the courage forged in the face of predators, and the cooperation born from the tribe, all of it became part of us. Even now, in a world lit by countless artificial fires and shielded by walls that our ancestors could never have imagined, those echoes remain. When we sit by a fire, when we gather to share food, when we look at the stars, or when we tell stories late into the night, we are doing the same things they did. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation. The Stone Age ended, but it never truly left us. It lives in our instincts, in the way our minds are drawn to the simple rhythm of flame and shadow, in our need to belong, and in the quiet knowledge that we are here because those who came before us learned to endure. And if you listen closely, past the noise of the present, past the walls and the streets and the hum of modern life, you can almost hear them. The sound of stones striking together, the crackle of the first fire, the distant calls of a hunt, the voices of people huddled close beneath the stars, speaking in a language older than words. Those echoes have never faded. They are in every one of us, a reminder of where we began and how far we have come. And though the world is no longer the same, that truth remains. We are the children of the Stone Age, shaped by its trials, carried forward by its lessons, and still walking in the shadow of our ancestors' fires. And so, from the first spark of fire to the planting of the first seeds, from the chipped stones to the stories whispered by firelight, the path of survival stretched across countless generations. Every step, every lesson, and every scar carried forward by those who came before us has led to this moment. We are their descendants, the ones who learned to stand in the darkness without fear because someone once lit a flame. The ones who can build, speak, and dream because tribes once sat together and shared their knowledge by firelight. The world we know, the safety, the comfort, the certainty, was born from their endless struggle against a world that gave them nothing freely. Yet their echoes remain, quiet but unbroken. We still look to the sky. We still gather around the glow of a fire, even if it is no longer our only defense. We still tell stories, though our words are now written instead of carved into memory. Beneath everything we have built, there is still something older, something that belongs to them. The Stone Age was not simply a distant chapter. It was the beginning of everything. It gave us our hands for making, our voices for sharing, our minds for imagining, and our need to stand together against the unknown. It shaped us in ways that no amount of time can erase. And maybe, if you think about it, we have never truly left it behind. The fire may burn brighter now. The tools may be sharper. The seeds may grow in fields instead of in wild soil. But the same human heart beats in our chests, carrying with it the memory of those who endured when survival was the only thing that mattered. The next time you sit in the quiet, watching the glow of a flame or feeling the pull of the night sky, remember them. Remember the hands that shaped the first tools, the voices that told the first stories, and the eyes that looked out into a world far larger and far harsher than ours, and refused to turn away. We are here because they endured, and their story, in every way that matters, is still ours.